Welcome back to Sleep Ages. Tonight's story begins with an English sailor who arrived in Japan expecting he might be killed, and ended with that same man receiving land and status from the ruler who would change Japan forever. His name was William Adams. When Adams left Europe, Japan was not supposed to become his home. He already had one. He had a wife, children, a profession, and a place in the maritime world of late Elizabethan England. He understood ships. He understood charts. He understood the practical mathematics of navigation at a time when a wrong calculation could move a vessel hundreds of miles away from where its crew believed it to be. Then, in 1598, he joined a Dutch expedition that attempted to reach Asia by sailing west. 5 ships left Europe. Only one would reach Japan. By the time that battered vessel finally appeared off the Japanese coast, disease, hunger, storms, violence, cold, and sheer distance had reduced its crew to a fraction of the men who had begun the journey. Some of the survivors were too weak to stand. Their ship carried weapons, trade goods, damaged equipment, and a group of strangers who could barely explain who they were. The Portuguese missionaries already established in Japan had their own explanation. These new arrivals, they warned, were dangerous pirates and enemies of the Catholic powers. Men like William Adams, they argued, should not be trusted. Adams was summoned inland. He was taken to meet Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the most powerful men in Japan and a political leader standing only months away from the struggle that would reshape the country. The meeting could have ended badly. Instead, Ieyasu began asking questions. Where was England? Why had these men sailed so far? Who were their enemies? How had they crossed the world? What did Adams know about ships, navigation, trade, and the countries beyond the seas around Japan? The Englishman who had arrived with almost nothing suddenly possessed something extremely valuable: information. In the years that followed, Adams would become useful to Ieyasu as a navigator, a source of knowledge about Europe, a shipbuilder, a commercial intermediary, and eventually a direct retainer with land and status in Japan. Popular retellings often simplify that transformation by saying that William Adams became a samurai. The historical reality is more precise and in many ways more interesting. He became a hatamoto, a direct retainer of the Tokugawa house, and was known in Japan as Miura Anjin, the pilot of Miura. But all of that came later, before the estate, before the Japanese name, before English merchants crossed half the world hoping that Adams might open doors for them. There was a ship moving slowly across an ocean that seemed to have no end, and there was a man on its deck who had no idea that he would never see England again. To understand how that happened, we need to return to the beginning, long before Japan entered his life. William Adams was born in Kent, in southeastern England, around the middle of the 16th century. He later described himself simply as a Kentish man from Gillingham, close to Chatham, where royal ships lay in the Medway. For a boy growing up there, the world of ships was not remote. Masts, timber, rope, sails, hulls under repair, sailors moving between shore and vessel, and the constant business of maintaining England's naval strength were part of the landscape. The sea was a profession before it was an adventure. That distinction matters, because Adams is often remembered through the extraordinary events that came later. It is easy to turn him into a restless wanderer who simply wanted to see what lay beyond Europe. The evidence suggests something more practical. He trained in shipbuilding, spent years learning the demanding work of navigation, and served as a master and pilot. He was a skilled maritime professional, living in an age when such skills were becoming increasingly important. European ships were traveling farther. English, Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish merchants competed for profitable routes. Monarchies and private investors backed voyages that combined commerce, diplomacy, and war in proportions that could change from one harbor to the next. A ship might carry cloth for trade, cannon for defense, letters for rulers, and men who were prepared to seize an opportunity if one appeared. Adams belonged to that world. He served in English ships and gained experience in waters far from home. By the closing years of the 16th century, he had spent much of his adult life around vessels and maritime trade. He knew that an ocean voyage was not a smooth line drawn across a map. It was a sequence of calculations and repairs. Water had to be preserved, food had to last, sails had to survive changing weather. A crew weakened by illness could turn even a manageable problem into a dangerous one, and no chart was perfect. Longitude could not yet be measured reliably at sea. Latitude was more manageable, but knowing how far north or south a vessel had traveled did not tell a pilot exactly how far east or west it had moved. Maps contained errors. Coastlines could be misplaced. Islands might appear where none existed, while real dangers might be absent entirely. The men who navigated these ships lived with uncertainty as part of their work. In 1598, that uncertainty became the foundation of the voyage that changed Adams's life. The expedition was Dutch, assembled during a period when the Dutch Republic was fighting Spain and challenging Iberian control of long-distance trade. The plan was ambitious. Rather than follow the Portuguese route around the Cape of Good Hope, the fleet would sail west across the Atlantic, pass through the Strait of Magellan at the southern end of South America, enter the Pacific, and continue toward Asian markets. There were 5 ships. Their Dutch names carried an optimism that history would treat with a kind of quiet irony. Hoop, Hope, Geloof, Faith, Liefde, Love, Trouw, Loyalty, and Blijde Boodschap, Good Tidings. William Adams sailed as a pilot with the expedition. His future would become tied most closely to the Liefde. In June 1598, the fleet left the Netherlands. From shore, 5 ships moving together must have looked reassuring. Their masts rose above the water in company, their crews numbered in the hundreds. They carried provisions, weapons, trade goods, spare equipment, and plans made by men who expected difficulty but also expected success. The early stages of a long voyage often contained that confidence. The ships were still relatively well supplied. The hulls had not yet endured months of stress. Men could still speak about future ports as real destinations rather than names that seemed to recede every week. But the expedition had already left late enough in the season to create problems. Winds did not cooperate. Progress was slower than hoped. Disease appeared. Stops that were meant to be temporary consumed time and supplies. Along the western coast of Africa and around the Cape Verde region, illness moved through the crews. Men who had left Europe only weeks earlier began to die before the expedition had even crossed the South Atlantic. This was one of the brutal realities of 16th century ocean travel. The greatest danger was not always a storm dramatic enough to be remembered in a painting. Often, it was water stored too long, food losing its quality, fever spreading below deck, or a wound that would have been ordinary on land becoming serious at sea. The fleet continued south and west. For Adams, navigation meant watching the sky, estimating position, comparing the ship's progress with charts, recording what could be measured, and making decisions with incomplete information. A pilot's work could appear quiet compared with battle or storm, but the survival of everyone aboard depended upon it. By the time the ships approached the southern end of South America, months had passed. Ahead lay the Strait of Magellan. On a modern map, the strait is a narrow route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific through a maze of channels between the South American mainland and the islands of Tierra del Fuego. To the men aboard Adams's fleet, it was more than a line between two oceans. It was a place of dangerous currents, unpredictable winds, cold weather, difficult anchorages, and very little room for error. They reached the region in 1599 and then remained trapped by conditions far longer than intended. Winter in the strait was punishing. The temperature fell. Winds turned narrow channels into hostile stretches of water. Crews waited for conditions that would allow the ships to move, then lost time again when those conditions changed. Food diminished. Clothing remained damp. Sickness took more men. A fleet designed for movement became a collection of wooden shelters trying to survive the weather. Weeks passed, then more weeks. The landscape around them was severe. Dark water, steep land, low cloud, sudden wind, long stretches where the geography itself seemed to close around the ships. Even when the crews could see land, they were still far from the kind of place where hundreds of exhausted Europeans could easily replace supplies. The men had already crossed the Atlantic. Yet the Pacific, the largest part of their intended journey, still lay ahead. That is one reason this voyage is difficult to understand if we look only at its final destination. Japan was not the first hardship. It was what came after a long sequence of hardships that had already reduced the expedition before it entered the ocean that would nearly destroy it. When the fleet finally moved out of the Strait of Magellan into the Pacific, relief did not last. The ships became separated. One vessel turned back and eventually returned to Europe. Others were pushed toward very different fates. Some crews would fall into Spanish or Portuguese hands. Some men would die far from the route they had expected to follow. The neat formation of 5 ships that had departed the Netherlands was disappearing. For Adams and the men who remained with the Liefde, the voyage continued along the Pacific side of South America. There were attempts to obtain food and supplies. There were encounters on shore that became violent. Commanders died. The expedition's leadership changed. Men who had once spoken confidently about trade in Asia were now dealing with much more immediate questions. How much food remained, how many sailors could still work, and whether another ship would appear over the horizon. Eventually, 2 vessels remained together, the Hoop and the Liefde. Hope and love. Their crews decided to cross the Pacific. It was an extraordinary decision, although the alternatives were not attractive. Spanish power along much of the American Pacific coast made remaining there dangerous. The Moluccas, farther south and west, were associated with the spice trade, But political and military risks surrounded those waters as well. Japan, known through European reports as a potential market, became a destination. The name would have carried a mixture of knowledge and uncertainty. Portuguese merchants and Jesuit missionaries had been active in Japan for decades. Europeans knew that the country contained wealthy cities, powerful regional lords, sophisticated crafts, and large internal markets. They also knew that Japan had endured generations of warfare. Information passed through merchants, missionaries, maps, and rumor, not through anything resembling a modern travel guide. Adams had never been there. None of the men could know exactly what reception awaited them. Still, they turned west. From the coast of South America to Japan, the Pacific stretched across distances that made the Atlantic crossing behind them seem almost like another journey entirely. The two ships sailed into it late in 1599. For a time, Hoop and Liefde remained companions. Then the ocean separated them. A severe storm struck in February 1600. The ships lost sight of one another. The Hoop was never seen by Adams again. No rescue was possible. No message arrived explaining what had happened. One ship simply disappeared from the horizon and from the voyage. For the crew of the Liefde, hope that their companion might reach Japan independently could survive for a while. At sea, uncertainty often lasted longer than grief because there was no proof. A missing vessel might have been blown onto another course. It might have suffered damage and slowed. It might still appear days later, but it did not. The Liefde continued alone. By then, the ship itself had become a small, exhausted whirl. Men were sick. Others were dead. The number able to work the vessel had fallen dangerously low. Food and water had been stretched across a crossing lasting month after month. Every necessary task became harder because fewer bodies were available to perform it. A sailing ship does not stop requiring labor simply because its crew is weak. Lines still have to be handled. Sail must still be adjusted. Water entering the hull must still be managed. The rudder must still be controlled. Someone must still keep watch. Someone must still calculate where the ship might be at moments. According to Adams's own later account, only a handful of men were strong enough to stand. He was one of them. This is where his professional training becomes central to the story. Adams was not important because he was English. In the middle of the Pacific, nationality could not make a sail hold wind or place a coastline in the correct latitude. What mattered was that he could still navigate. The surviving men were aiming for a country that European maps did not place with perfect accuracy. Adams later complained that Japan lay incorrectly on the charts and globes available to him. It was not a small problem. When a crew is healthy and provisions are good, searching for a misplaced coast is frustrating. When nearly everyone aboard is ill and the ship has crossed the Pacific in misery, it can become fatal. They sailed north and west, looking for land that did not appear where they expected it. The days accumulated. The ocean remained. There is a particular kind of fear in looking for a coastline that should already be there. A storm is visible. A broken mast is visible. A sick man lying below deck is visible. An error on a map is invisible until the ship reaches the empty water where land was supposed to be. Adams adjusted. The Liefde kept moving. Then, in April 1600, after more than 4 months crossing the Pacific, land finally appeared. Japan. The coastline near Bungo, on the island of Kyushu, did not look like salvation in the way a modern port might. There were no familiar harbor authorities, no English or Dutch representatives waiting, no common language, and no certainty that the people ashore would permit these exhausted foreigners to remain. But it was land. That alone changed everything. When the Leifty came to anchor, the surviving crew was in terrible condition. Later accounts differ slightly in their exact numbers at different moments, but the basic picture is clear. Only around 24 men were still alive from a ship that had begun the expedition with roughly 100, and only a small number could stand or move with any strength. Japanese boats approached. The Europeans could not resist even if they had wanted to. Adams later remembered that the local people did them no physical harm, although items disappeared from the ship in the confusion. The local authorities took control of the situation. The sick were brought ashore and given food and shelter. After so many months, the men of the Leifty had reached a society that was neither empty nor isolated. Kyushu had ports, political authorities, merchants, religious communities, and long experience with foreign visitors. Portuguese traders had been coming to Japan since the middle of the 16th century. Catholic missionaries had established churches and relationships with Japanese lords. Nagasaki had become deeply connected to Portuguese commerce. So when the Dutch-led vessel appeared, it did not enter a world that knew nothing of Europe. It entered a world where some Europeans already had powerful interests, and those Europeans did not welcome the newcomers. The religious division of Europe had crossed the oceans with its sailors. Portugal and Spain were Catholic powers. England and the Dutch Republic were Protestant rivals, fighting them in Europe and competing with them overseas. To Portuguese observers, the men of the Leifty were not simply tired travelers. They belonged to hostile maritime powers. Their ship had sailed through regions of Spanish and Portuguese influence. Its cargo included weapons. The accusation that followed was therefore politically useful and not entirely detached from the realities of the expedition. The strangers were called pirates. Portuguese Jesuits urged Japanese authorities to treat them as dangerous enemies. For Adams and his companions, the argument happening around them was difficult to control. They did not speak Japanese. Their best chance to explain themselves depended partly on Portuguese, the language associated with the very people who regarded them as rivals. The crew that had survived an ocean now faced a different kind of danger: interpretation. What did the weapons on their ship mean? What had they intended to do in the Pacific? Were they merchants, soldiers, privateers, pirates, or some uncomfortable combination typical of the era? Who had authority over them? And why had they appeared in Japan at precisely this moment? That last question mattered because Japan itself was approaching a political crisis. 2 years earlier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had died. Hideyoshi had risen from relatively modest origins to become the dominant military ruler of Japan and had brought most of the country under a unified authority after generations of conflict. But his heir, Hideyori, was still a child. A council of powerful lords had been left to preserve the political order until the boy could rule. Among those lords was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was experienced, wealthy, patient, and enormously powerful. He controlled extensive lands and commanded deep networks of loyalty. His rivals watched him carefully because everyone understood the same problem. A system built around a child heir and a group of ambitious military leaders contained the possibility of conflict from the beginning. In the spring of 1600, that conflict had not yet reached its decisive battlefield, but the balance was already shifting. Then news reached Ieyasu that a strange European vessel had arrived in Kyushu, carrying guns, ammunition, foreign sailors, and a navigator capable of describing routes across oceans that most Japanese officials had never traveled. Ieyasu wanted to know more. The captain of the Leafty was too ill to make the journey. William Adams was summoned instead. For the English pilot, the order meant leaving his weakened companions behind and traveling into the interior of a country he had entered only days earlier. He had no way to know whether he was being called to explain himself, to negotiate, or to be judged. Adams later wrote about the moment with unusual simplicity. He took leave of the sick men aboard and placed himself, as he saw it, in the hands of God. The same protection he believed had carried him through the dangers of the sea. Then he traveled toward Osaka. The journey itself must have been disorienting. For nearly 2 years, Adams's world had been dominated by ships, crowded decks, wet rope, damaged sails, cold anchorages, shorelines glimpsed from sea, and the endless movement of water. Now he was being carried through one of the most densely organized and politically sophisticated societies in Asia. Japan at the turn of the 17th century was not a single visual world. Coastal villages, castle towns, farming communities, temples, ports, military roads, and great urban centers existed within a political landscape still shaped by the wars of the previous generations. As Adams moved toward Osaka, he would have seen signs of authority everywhere. Armed retainers, checkpoints, boats moving people and goods, cultivated land, storehouses, towns built around castles and markets. He also carried something unusual with him, a story of the world beyond Japan. When Adams eventually reached Osaka, the scale of the place made an impression on him. He later described the residence where he met Ieyasu as extraordinarily costly and richly decorated. That description matters because the meeting is sometimes imagined as an encounter between a civilized Japanese court and a wild European castaway, or the reverse, depending on who tells the story. Neither picture is useful. Adams was an experienced navigator from a maritime society expanding rapidly into global trade. Ieyasu was a veteran statesman and warlord operating within a sophisticated political culture and commanding resources far beyond anything Adams personally possessed. Each man had knowledge the other did not. That is what made the encounter important. When Adams was brought before Ieyasu, the Japanese lord studied him. Communication was awkward at first. Gestures carried part of the conversation. Eventually, a Portuguese-speaking interpreter was used. Ieyasu began with basic questions. What country was Adams from? Why had he come so far? Adams explained England and the search for trade in the East Indies. He described his country's desire for commerce with distant rulers. He showed routes and tried to explain the voyage that had carried the fleet westward across the Atlantic, through the Strait of Magellan, and across the Pacific. Ieyasu asked whether England was at war. Adams answered that England fought Spain and Portugal while remaining at peace with other nations. That answer immediately changed the context of the Portuguese warnings. The conflict was not simply between Christians and non-Christians, nor between lawful Europeans and pirates. Europe itself was divided. The Portuguese missionaries, presenting Adams as an enemy, belonged to states that were already enemies of Adams's own country. For Ieyasu, this was useful information. He did not have to accept the Portuguese interpretation of European politics as the only one available. Adams could provide another. The questions continued: trade, navigation, geography, religion, the structure of distant kingdoms, the reason for the weapons aboard the Leaf Day. Adams later remembered Ieyasu as unexpectedly favorable toward him. That did not mean trust had been established in a single afternoon. Adams was questioned again in later meetings. His fate remained uncertain. His companions still did not know what would happen to them. But one crucial thing had changed. Tokugawa Ieyasu had decided that William Adams was more useful alive than dead. That decision sounds obvious, only because we know what came afterward. At the time, Adams could not know that the man questioning him would win the Battle of Sekigahara later that year, become Shogun in 1603, and establish a political order that would shape Japan for more than 2.5 centuries. He could not know that his knowledge of navigation and shipbuilding would earn him a place near that new government. He could not know that English merchants would eventually arrive in Japan, carrying letters from King James I, and discover that a countryman they had almost given up for dead had become one of their most valuable introductions at the Tokugawa court. And he certainly could not know that centuries later, the broad outline of his life would help inspire one of the most famous fictional stories ever written about early modern Japan. For the moment, he was simply an exhausted pilot standing far from home, trying to answer questions carefully enough to survive them. The ocean had carried him to Japan. Now, politics would decide whether he could ever leave. The ocean had carried William Adams to Japan. Now, politics would decide whether he could ever leave. The man standing across from him in Osaka was not yet Shogun. Tokugawa Ieyasu did not officially receive that title until 1603. In the spring of 1600, he was one of several great lords competing inside a political system that had become dangerously unstable after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. That distinction is important. It is tempting, looking backward, to imagine Ieyasu as a ruler whose victory was already certain. It was not. He was powerful, experienced, and rich. But he still had rivals capable of organizing enormous armies against him. The country Adams had entered was only months away from a conflict that would decide who possessed the strongest position in Japan. Adams could not have understood all of those rivalries immediately. Even a Japanese observer needed years of family connections, regional loyalties, old grudges, marriages, hostages, land grants, and military service to understand the political map. An exhausted English pilot, newly arrived from the Pacific, had almost none of that context. What he could understand was Ieyasu himself. The questions kept coming. Adams was questioned more than once. He explained where England lay, how European powers fought one another, why Englishmen and Dutchmen were enemies of Spain and Portugal, how their ships crossed oceans, and why weapons aboard a trading vessel did not automatically prove that its crew had come to attack Japan. For the Portuguese missionaries who had warned against the newcomers, this was an uncomfortable development. Their advantage had been interpretation. They already possessed language, networks, and long familiarity with Japanese elites. Now Ieyasu had access to a Protestant European who could describe the same distant world from a completely different side. Adams did not need Ieyasu to admire England. He only needed him to remain curious. And Ieyasu was curious. The surviving crew of the Leaf Day was not executed. Their property and movements remained subject to Japanese authority, and the future of the ship itself was no longer entirely in their hands. But the immediate threat passed. For Adams, survival created a new problem. He wanted to go home. That desire is one of the simplest facts in the story, and one of the easiest to lose beneath everything that happened later. The titles, the estate, the Japanese name, the ships he would build, and the merchants who would seek his help can make his life in Japan appear like a deliberate reinvention. It was not. At least not at first. He had crossed the Pacific because the expedition had nearly run out of alternatives. He had landed in Japan because the Leaf Day could barely continue. He had impressed Ieyasu because doing so helped him stay alive. Nothing in that sequence required him to stop thinking about England. Somewhere beyond the oceans was Mary, his wife. There were children who had watched him leave. They had no instant way to know whether his expedition had reached Asia, been captured, turned back, or vanished at sea. And Adams had no reliable route home. For a man trained to calculate position, that must have been a strange kind of helplessness. He could explain latitude. He could estimate the course of a ship. He could draw the route that had brought him across the world. But the distance between knowing where England was and actually returning there remained enormous. Before that question could be settled, Japan's own political crisis accelerated. During the months after Adams arrived, the struggle surrounding the Toyotomi succession hardened into open confrontation. Ishida Mitsunari, an administrator associated with the Toyotomi government, became one of the central organizers of a coalition against Ieyasu. Powerful daimyo chose sides. Castles, roads, hostages, alliances, and military movements began to matter with increasing urgency. The conflict is often reduced to two names: Ieyasu in the east and Mitsunari in the west. The reality was more complicated. Neither side represented a modern political party. The great lords who joined them carried their own motives. Some had old rivalries. Some calculated which coalition was likely to protect their lands. Some changed their behavior as the balance shifted. Personal loyalty, fear, family strategy, resentment, opportunity, and survival were all mixed together. Adams was present in Japan while this happened, but there is no good reason to turn him into a secret hero of the coming battle. He did not become the foreign swordsman who decided the future of Japan. That belongs to fiction. His importance lay elsewhere. On the 21st of October, 1600, by the modern calendar, the rival coalitions met at Sekigahara in central Japan. The battlefield lay in a valley surrounded by hills. Tens of thousands of men were involved. Banners marked units. Arquebuses, spears, bows, swords, cavalry, and disciplined formations all played roles in a conflict whose result would reshape political power. For hours, the outcome was uncertain. Then the Western coalition began to break. The reasons included battlefield decisions, divided loyalties, and defections that historians have debated in detail ever since. What matters for Adams's story is the result. Ieyasu won. He did not become absolute ruler overnight. He still had rivals to manage, settlements to enforce, domains to redistribute, and the surviving Toyotomi house remained a political reality. But Sekigahara changed the balance more completely than anything Adams had witnessed since reaching Japan. The man who had decided to keep the English pilot alive was now the strongest military figure in the country. That made Adams's future safer in one sense and more complicated in another. The more useful he became to Ieyasu, the less likely Ieyasu was to let him disappear onto the first ship heading west. Adams continued to ask for permission to leave. Ieyasu refused. The refusal was not necessarily an act of personal cruelty. From Ieyasu's perspective, Adams possessed rare knowledge. Japan had long experience with Portuguese ships and merchants, but Adams offered different routes, different contacts, and direct practical expertise in Northern European navigation and ship construction. He could discuss the commercial ambitions of England and the Dutch Republic. He could explain rivalries among European states instead of presenting Europe as a single distant civilization. Most importantly, he could build things and calculate things. Those skills made him difficult to replace. In 1603, Ieyasu received the title of Shogun from the imperial court. The title placed him at the head of a new military government, although political authority in Japan still depended on a careful network of relationships. Edo, the castle town associated with the Tokugawa house, was growing into the center of that new order. Roads, residences, storehouses, canals, markets, and administrative spaces expanded around it. Adams had arrived in Japan at the end of one age. He was now living through the beginning of another, and his place inside it was becoming more permanent. One of the clearest reasons was shipbuilding. Ieyasu wanted vessels constructed in a European style. For Adams, this request brought him back to knowledge acquired long before the Pacific crossing, before the storms, before Osaka, before anyone in Japan had heard his name. He had trained around ships from childhood. Now, that training had become political capital. Around 1604, Adams became involved with Japanese shipwrights at Ito on the Izu Peninsula, south of the growing Tokugawa Center at Edo. The task was not to import a completed European ship and copy it plank by plank. The men had to work with local timber, local craftsmen, available tools, Japanese building experience, and Adams's knowledge of Western hull forms and rigging. That makes the project more interesting than the simple phrase, Adams built a ship for the Shogun. No man built a large sailing vessel alone. A ship was a community of skills. Timber had to be selected and shaped. Curves had to be judged. Frames had to carry weight without becoming unnecessarily heavy. Planks needed to meet closely enough to survive open water. Masts had to be stepped. Rigging had to distribute force. A rudder had to respond predictably. The finished hull needed balance once cargo, crew, water, and provisions were aboard. Japanese shipwrights already possessed sophisticated maritime traditions of their own. Adams brought a different design language. At Ito, those traditions met through practical work. The first vessel was relatively small by the standards of the Leaf Day, around 80 tons according to later accounts. Yet its significance did not depend on its size. It floated, it sailed. Ieyasu inspected it and was pleased enough to order another, larger vessel. The second ship, built a few years later, was around 120 tons. There is something quietly remarkable about that moment. The original Dutch expedition had been destroyed by the sea. The Hoop had vanished. The Leaf Day had reached Japan as a damaged survivor and eventually ceased to be useful as a ship. The voyage that brought Adams east had been defined by vessels failing, disappearing, and breaking down. Now, in Japan, he was helping create new ones. The relationship with Ieyasu deepened. Adams's later letters show a man who understood that his position depended on service. He advised on navigation and maritime questions. He became useful in contacts with foreign merchants. He could interpret European intentions, although language often still required intermediaries, and his knowledge had limits like anyone else's. He was not standing beside Ieyasu every hour of every day. He was not secretly directing the government of Japan, but he had access. For a foreigner in the early 17th century, that access was extraordinary. It also changed his social position. Adams became a direct retainer of the Tokugawa house, a hatamoto. Popular accounts often translate this transformation into the sentence, "William Adams became a samurai." That is understandable, but it can create the wrong picture if we imagine him immediately becoming a wandering swordsman in armor. Hatamoto described a direct retainer, literally one associated with the Lord's banner. It was a position within the Tokugawa political and military order. Adams received status, income, and obligations because Ieyasu considered his service valuable. He was also granted an estate at Hemi on the Miura Peninsula near the entrance to Edo Bay. The estate was assessed at about 250 koku. Koku was a measure tied to rice and income, commonly used to express the productive value of land. For Adams, the grant meant something far more tangible than a title written on paper. It meant a household. It meant land. It meant people whose agricultural work supported that household. It meant that the foreign sailor who had arrived in Japan, unable to stand safely on his own future, now possessed a recognized place inside Tokugawa society. He came to be known as Miura Anjin. Anjin meant pilot. Miura connected him to the district where his estate lay. Names carry identity, but in Adams's case the new name did not erase the old one as neatly as legend sometimes suggests. William Adams did not stop being William Adams in his own mind. His surviving letters are written by a man who still described himself as English, still remembered Kent, still thought about his family, and still addressed countrymen he hoped might eventually hear of him. At the same time, Miura Anjin was not merely a costume he put on for Japanese society. He had responsibilities there. He had property there. He had relationships there. His life was becoming genuinely divided between two worlds. That division became personal as well as political. Adams formed a family in Japan. Sources identify a Japanese wife, commonly known in later accounts as Oyuki, and the couple had children, a son named Joseph and a daughter named Susanna. The details of Adams's domestic life are much less complete than the broad outline of his public career. That silence is worth respecting. Historical records preserve contracts, trade privileges, letters between merchants, and decisions made by rulers far more often than they preserve the private conversations of a household. We know enough, however, to see the difficult shape of his situation. In England, he already had a wife and children. In Japan, after years in which returning home remained impossible, he created another family and another household. This is not the clean transformation of a fictional hero who leaves one identity behind and chooses another. It is messier, more human, and probably more painful. For years, the people in England who loved him had little reason to know that he was alive. To understand what that meant, it helps to remove one modern assumption from the story. There was no international postal system connecting Edo with Kent in a predictable chain. A letter had to find a ship. The ship had to survive. It had to reach a port connected to merchants who knew where the letter should go next. Months could become years. A reply, if one came, had to complete the same dangerous journey in reverse. News itself traveled as cargo, and like cargo, it could be lost. Adams had become important in Japan before England even knew where to look for him. Meanwhile, the Tokugawa government continued to reshape the country. Ieyasu transferred the title of Shogun to his son Hidetada in 1605, creating the appearance of succession within the Tokugawa house, while Ieyasu himself remained deeply influential. He increasingly operated from Sunpu in Suruga, but foreign merchants and Japanese lords alike understood that his approval still mattered. For Adams, this meant learning not just a language and a set of customs, but a political geography. Edo mattered, Sunpu mattered, Osaka mattered, Kyushu's ports mattered. Hirado, far to the west, would soon matter enormously. The distances were significant. Japan was not a court with one gate through which every foreigner entered. Trade came through different ports. Daimyo controlled regional interests. The shogunate tried to shape foreign relations without possessing anything like a modern centralized customs service. This left space for knowledgeable intermediaries. Adams became one of them. He could speak to Dutchmen as a fellow Northern European sailor. He could explain Tokugawa expectations to newcomers who knew almost nothing about Japanese political etiquette. He could tell Japanese officials which European powers were likely to cooperate and which rivalries might be useful. He was never neutral. He had his own loyalties and interests. He remained hostile to the Portuguese and Spanish Catholic powers whose representatives had once described him as a pirate. He wanted Northern European trade to succeed. He also depended on the favor of the Tokugawa government. But that combination made him unusually valuable. In 1609, almost 9 years after the Liefde reached Japan, 2 Dutch ships arrived at Hirado. This was the kind of arrival Adams had been waiting for. The Dutch East India Company had been founded in 1602 after Adams had already left Europe. During the years he spent learning how to survive in Japan, the VOC had developed into one of the most powerful commercial organizations in Asia. Its ships brought letters and gifts intended for Ieyasu. The Dutch wanted formal trading rights. Adams helped them navigate the political process. Ieyasu granted permission, and a Dutch trading post was established at Hirado. For Adams, the event must have contained an extraordinary mixture of emotions. Here were men connected to the same Dutch maritime world that had sent him across the Atlantic 11 years earlier. They had not arrived as starving castaways. They came as representatives of a growing commercial power. They carried news from a world that had continued moving while Adams had been absent from it. People he had known would be older. Political rulers had changed. Companies had been created. Wars had continued. Children had grown. England itself had a different monarch. Queen Elizabeth I had died in 1603. James VI of Scotland now also ruled England as James I. Adams had left one England and was hearing about another. The presence of Dutch merchants also demonstrated how much his position had changed. In 1600, he had needed Europeans already in Japan to interpret him to Japanese authority. By 1609, Europeans arriving in Japan could need William Adams to interpret Japan to them. That reversal is one of the most important transformations in his life. He was no longer simply the foreigner being examined. He had become the man who knew the road to the people who made decisions. The same year brought another episode that connected Adams's shipbuilding directly to the Pacific world that had nearly killed him. In September 1609, a Spanish galleon named San Francisco was wrecked on the Japanese coast while returning from the Philippines toward New Spain, the Spanish territories in Mexico. Hundreds of survivors reached shore and were assisted by local people and Japanese authorities. Among them was Rodrigo de Vivero, a former governor of the Philippines. The accident created an opportunity for diplomacy between Japan and New Spain. And when the Spanish survivors needed a way to cross the Pacific, a vessel built in Japan under Adams's direction became part of the solution. The larger Western-style ship from Ito was provided for the voyage. It became known as the San Buenaventura. In 1610, it crossed from Japan to New Spain. Think about the symmetry of that for a moment. 10 years earlier, Adams had crossed the Pacific aboard a dying ship, searching desperately for a coastline his charts did not place correctly. Now a ship built in Japan with his knowledge was crossing that ocean in the opposite direction, carrying diplomats and sailors toward the Americas. The ocean had not become smaller. It had become connected differently. And Adams stood at one of those connections. His usefulness gave him privilege, but privilege did not remove the central contradiction of his life. He still wanted contact with England. The Dutch could carry messages, but they were not his countrymen. Their interests were commercial, and their routes connected Japan with Dutch bases elsewhere in Asia rather than directly with an English home waiting for news. Adams began to look outward through those networks. Somewhere in Southeast Asia, English merchants were now operating too. The English East India Company had been chartered in 1600, the same year Adams reached Japan. It established trading operations across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, including at Bantam on Java. For years, Adams had been living inside the expanding world of Asian trade without direct contact with the English company that might finally connect him to home. Then, in 1611, he learned that English merchants were at Bantam. He did not know them personally. They did not know him. But that almost made the moment more powerful. After more than a decade, William Adams could write to Englishmen simply because they were Englishmen. On the 23rd of October, 1611, at Hirado, he composed a letter to what he called his unknown friends and countrymen at Bantam. The surviving letter is one of the most important windows into his life because Adams had to explain himself from the beginning. He identified himself as a Kentish man. He described where he had been born near Rochester and Chatham. He explained his apprenticeship in Limehouse, near London. He described his work as a master and pilot. Then he told the extraordinary story of the voyage that had carried him to Japan. There is something moving about the practical tone of the document. Adams had spent years receiving titles and land in a country thousands of miles away, yet when he finally reached toward England through writing, he began with geography close to home. Kent, Rochester, Chatham, Limehouse, places that could be located by men who had never seen Japan. It was as if he were rebuilding a bridge from the familiar end. He also had commercial reasons to write. Adams believed England could trade profitably with Japan. He had already seen the Dutch gain privileges. He understood the opportunities and the obstacles. An English factory in Japan could benefit from someone who knew Tokugawa officials, understood local expectations, and had spent more than a decade learning the rhythms of the country. But beneath the commercial language was a simpler fact. He wanted his countrymen to know that he was alive. For 11 years, William Adams had existed beyond the edge of English certainty. He had not vanished. He had crossed the world, survived, and become Miura Anjin. Now, for the first time, a realistic path was opening between those two identities. The letter left Hirado. Whether it would arrive was another question. Adams had learned not to trust distance easily. A ship could disappear. A storm could scatter a fleet. A message could sit for months in a warehouse waiting for the right vessel. But if the letter reached English merchants, and if those merchants believed what they read, something might finally happen that Adams had imagined for years. England might come to Japan looking for him, and 2 years later, a ship appeared off Hirado carrying English merchants, a letter from King James I, and a captain named John Blackthorne. The men aboard had come to open trade with Japan. They were also about to discover that the English navigator they had heard about was not a prisoner waiting helplessly to be rescued. He had land, he had status, he had a Japanese household. He had direct access to the political world they needed to enter. And after 13 years away, William Adams would finally stand face to face with countrymen who had sailed from the England he remembered. That meeting should have made the choice simple. Go home. Instead, it would reveal just how complicated home had become. For 13 years, William Adams had imagined what it might feel like to meet Englishmen again. Then, in the summer of 1613, they finally arrived. The ship was called the Clove. She entered the harbor at Hirado after a voyage that had carried her from England around the Cape of Good Hope and across the trading routes of Asia. Her captain was John Blackthorne, an experienced merchant in the service of the English East India Company. With him came letters, gifts, merchandise, instructions from the company, and a formal message from King James I. They had not crossed half the world simply to find William Adams. Their larger purpose was trade, but Adams was the man who could make that purpose possible. When news reached him that an English ship had arrived, the moment must have felt almost unreal. He had spent more than a decade explaining England to Japanese officials. Now England had appeared in Japan, not as a memory, not as a name in a letter, as a ship in a harbor, as English voices, as men who had recently walked streets he still remembered. For the first time since 1598, Adams could speak with countrymen who had crossed directly through the world he had left behind. They brought news that was ordinary to them and extraordinary to him. England had changed monarchs. Queen Elizabeth was dead. James I now ruled. The East India Company, created in the same year Adams had reached Japan, had become an expanding commercial organization, with ships moving through the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. London had continued to grow. Merchants he had never met knew of markets that had scarcely existed when he left. The country he remembered had not waited for him, and Adams himself had changed just as completely. To Saris and the other Englishmen, the man they encountered was not a shipwrecked pilot hoping for rescue. He was a landholder, a Tokugawa retainer, a man with a Japanese household, a man who could travel to the political center of the country and be received by people the newcomers desperately needed to impress. John Saris had arrived in Japan as captain of the English expedition, but in one important sense, he was the stranger. Adams knew the roads. Adams knew the court. Adams knew which gestures mattered. He knew that a commercial request could not simply be shouted across a harbor. It had to move through hierarchy, through gifts, through formal audiences, through relationships built over years. The English had finally found him, and almost immediately they needed him. The journey inland began. Saris carried a letter from King James and gifts intended for Tokugawa authority. Among the objects was a telescope, a device still new enough in Europe to carry real prestige as a royal present. Adams accompanied the English party. Their route carried them eastward through a Japan he had learned over 13 years, and the newcomers were seeing for the first time. For Saris, every castle town, checkpoint, temple, road station, and procession could be interpreted as evidence of a distant and unfamiliar political culture. For Adams, many of those same things had become part of ordinary travel. That difference sometimes produced tension. Saris observed that Adams had adapted deeply to Japanese customs. He was not always pleased by it. Adams, for his part, had spent years learning that survival and influence depended on behaving in ways Japanese officials understood. He had little reason to discard that knowledge, simply because countrymen had finally arrived. The two men shared a language and a nationality. That did not mean they shared the same experience. Saris had come to Japan with a ship under his command and instructions from a trading company. Adams had come there almost dead. Saris expected eventually to sail away. Adams had built a life because for years he had not been allowed to do so. The distance between them was larger than the miles that separated England from Japan. It had been made by time. They traveled first toward the Tokugawa centers of power. Ieyasu was no longer the official shogun. He had transferred that title to his son Hidetada in 1605. But the older statesman remained the dominant political figure, and foreign merchants understood that his approval mattered. The English, therefore, needed both recognition and access. Adams helped provide them. At Sunpu, they entered Ieyasu's political world. The meeting joined two monarchies that had never exchanged ambassadors in the modern sense and knew very little about one another. King James's letter spoke across continents. The English sought permission to trade. They wanted protection for their merchants and ships. They wanted the right to establish a permanent commercial presence. Ieyasu had reasons to listen. Portuguese merchants had long connected Japan with Asian markets. The Dutch had gained permission to trade. Competition among foreigners could benefit Tokugawa policy by preventing any one European group from controlling access to particular goods or information. Adams had been explaining such rivalries for years. Now, one of those rival powers stood in the room. The English continued to Edo, where they met Hidetada. The younger Tokugawa ruler gave ceremonial gifts intended for King James, including Japanese armor. The exchange was not merely decorative. Gifts were part of diplomatic language. Objects demonstrated respect, wealth, craftsmanship, and intention. A suit of armor traveling from Japan to England carried more than metal. It carried evidence that a relationship had been acknowledged. Then came the practical result. The English received trading privileges. They were granted written authorization allowing them to reside and trade in Japan. For the East India Company, this was the prize the voyage had been designed to obtain. For Adams, something even more personal happened during the same journey. He asked again for permission to leave Japan. This time, permission was granted. After 13 years, the door home was finally open. That should have ended the story. William Adams had wanted this for years. He had written of England. He had remembered his family. He had repeatedly asked Ieyasu to let him go. Now, an English ship sat at Hirado. Its captain intended to return west. Adams had authorization. He had countrymen. He had a route. He could go home, and yet he did not. This is one of the most complicated moments in his life, because later retellings often try to reduce it to a single emotion. Some imagine that Japan had become so completely his true home that England no longer mattered. Others suggest that disagreement with John Saris made the decision for him. There is evidence for tension between the two men. Adams later referred to discourtesies he had received. Saris could be suspicious of Adams' loyalties and uncomfortable with how completely he had adapted to Japanese life. Money mattered as well. So did Adams's property. So did his Japanese household. So did the position he had spent years creating. The truth was probably not one clean choice between England and Japan. By 1613, Adams belonged imperfectly to both. If he sailed to England, what exactly would he return to? Mary had lived without him for 13 years. His children had grown through the years of his absence. He would arrive not as the man who had departed, but as someone who had spent more than a decade serving a foreign ruler and raising another family on the opposite side of the world. And if he remained in Japan, the absence continued. There was no decision available that restored the life of 1,598. That life no longer existed, so Adams stayed. He entered the service of the English East India Company in Japan. The choice gave the company exactly what it needed. Someone who understood both the maritime world that had brought them east and the political world in which they now hoped to trade. John Saris eventually sailed away aboard the Clove. He carried goods. He carried reports. He carried Japanese gifts for the English king. And he carried news that William Adams was alive. Adams watched another English ship leave Japan without him. This time, unlike every previous occasion, the barrier was no longer simply Ieyasu's refusal. The decision had become his own. There is no reason to imagine that watching the Clove disappear was easy. A ship leaving harbor can represent freedom to the person aboard it. To the person remaining on shore, it can represent the opposite. But Adams had made his choice for the moment. Now he had work to do. The English factory at Hirado was placed under the direction of Richard Cox. The word factory can be misleading to a modern listener. This was not a manufacturing plant. In early East India Company language, a factory was a trading establishment operated by factors, merchants who bought, sold, stored, negotiated, recorded accounts, and maintained relationships. The English rented buildings. They established warehouses. They organized goods. They kept books. They sent letters. They waited for ships. They tried to understand markets already occupied by experienced Japanese, Chinese, Portuguese, and Dutch merchants. And they discovered quickly that receiving permission to trade was not the same as making money. Japan was not an empty market waiting for English cloth. The company had to learn what people actually wanted. English merchants arrived with assumptions formed far away. Some goods sold poorly. Some prices disappointed them. Competition was intense. Distance made every mistake expensive. A merchant in London could not change an order after learning that a cargo was unsuitable. By the time information crossed to Europe and a new ship returned, years could pass. This was a world in which commercial intelligence aged slowly and arrived late. Adams became indispensable precisely because he already possessed local knowledge. He could travel. He could negotiate. He could explain. He could introduce. Richard Cox came to value him greatly. Their relationship appears to have been more cooperative than the strained connection between Adams and Saris. Cox understood that the English factory needed someone who could move comfortably through Japanese society. Adams understood that the factory could connect him to English ships, English correspondence, and commercial opportunities beyond Japan. For a time, their interests aligned, but the location of the English factory created difficulties. Adams had favored a position closer to the eastern political and commercial centers. Hirado lay far to the west. It had advantages. The harbor was established. The local lord welcomed foreign merchants. The Dutch were already there. Ships arriving from Southeast Asia could reach it without sailing along the entire Japanese coast. But distance from Edo and Sunpu meant that negotiations with Tokugawa authority required long journeys. The richest concentrations of political power were far away. The English had gained broad privileges. Their physical base, however, sat on the edge of the country. That decision would shape nearly everything the factory attempted. Adams spent the next years moving between those worlds. Hirado, Edo, Sonpu, ports farther south, and routes leading out of Japan toward Southeast Asia. His old profession as a navigator returned again, but under very different circumstances. The first great expedition had carried him helplessly into Japan. Now he began sailing outward from Japan by choice. The East India Company wanted access to regional trade. A successful factory could not depend only on ships coming directly from England. Asian commerce was already dense and interconnected. Silk moved, silver moved, spices moved, deerskins, metals, textiles, medicines, ceramics, and countless other goods moved between ports from Japan to China, Southeast Asia, and the islands between them. European companies inserted themselves into networks that had existed long before they arrived. Adams understood that better than most newly arrived Englishmen. He had spent years watching how Japanese trade actually worked. He also had something very useful: permission to command voyages under Japanese authority. Ships sailing with official Red Seal authorization could conduct overseas trade under recognized protection. Adams became involved in such voyages, but before those journeys carried him south, Japan itself entered the final crisis of the generation that had begun with Hideyoshi. The Toyotomi house still existed. Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, had grown from the child whose inheritance had created political uncertainty in 1600 into a young man at the center of a dangerous alternative power. His great stronghold was Osaka Castle. The castle was more than a residence. It was one of the most formidable political symbols in Japan. Behind its walls gathered men who had reasons to oppose Tokugawa rule, including warriors left without secure positions after previous settlements. For Ieyasu, the continued existence of a powerful Toyotomi center meant that the new Tokugawa order was not yet beyond challenge. By 1614, tension could no longer be contained. The conflict that followed is remembered as the Siege of Osaka, though it unfolded in two major campaigns. Adams was not the hero of this war. He did not decide it. Again, it is important not to drag him into the center of every dramatic event simply because he happened to live nearby in history. But he was close enough to Tokugawa political life to understand what the conflict meant. The older Ieyasu had won Sekigahara 14 years earlier. Now he was moving to eliminate the last great military focus around which resistance to his family's order might gather. In the winter campaign of 1614, Tokugawa forces surrounded Osaka. The fortress was immense. Its walls, moats, towers, and defended approaches made a direct assault costly. Artillery was used. Negotiation followed fighting. An agreement was eventually reached, but peace did not last. During the interval, the defenses of Osaka were weakened. The next year, conflict resumed. The summer campaign of 1615 ended decisively. Toyotomi resistance collapsed. Osaka Castle fell. Hideyori died. The political order that had once seemed uncertain became far more secure. For Adams, the significance was not that he had participated in a heroic battlefield adventure. It was that the man who had protected him since 1600 had now completed the central political work of his career. Ieyasu had outlived rivals. He had won Sekigahara. He had created a hereditary shogunate. He had placed Hidetada in office. And now the Toyotomi challenge was gone. The Japan Adams had first entered as an exhausted stranger was disappearing. A different country was taking shape around him. Roads and castle towns were increasingly organized under Tokugawa power. Daimyo still possessed large domains and local authority, but the political framework binding them to the shogunate was becoming stronger. Foreign trade was also becoming more carefully managed. Christianity, once tolerated in many places and supported by some powerful lords, came under increasing suspicion. The shogunate worried about loyalties that might cross political boundaries. Missionary activity became harder. Restrictions increased. Foreign merchants remained useful, but usefulness did not mean unlimited freedom. Adams had once benefited from Ieyasu's curiosity about the outside world. Now the Tokugawa state was learning to regulate that world more deliberately. The change mattered for the English factory. It mattered for the Dutch. It mattered for Portuguese missionaries and merchants. And it mattered for Adams personally. He had built his position through one relationship above all others, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Then, in 1616, Ieyasu died. For 16 years, nearly the entire Japanese chapter of William Adams's life had unfolded under the protection of a man who had chosen not to execute him. That relationship had survived the uncertainty of 1600, the rise of the shogunate, the construction of ships, the arrival of Dutch and English merchants, and the final destruction of Toyotomi power. Now it was over. Hidetada remained shogun. The Tokugawa system did not collapse with Ieyasu's death. That was precisely the point of the political order Ieyasu had spent years constructing. But Adams's position could not remain exactly the same. Personal access is difficult to inherit. A favor granted by one ruler does not automatically carry the same weight with the next. Hidetada had met Adams. He knew who he was. But the older man's fascination with the English navigator had been unusual. Adams could no longer assume that his advice would receive the same attention. Foreign trading privileges also narrowed. The English found that broad freedoms granted earlier could be restricted in practice. Their trade became concentrated around particular ports. For the merchants at Hirado, the problem was serious. Their factory had never been highly profitable. Now the political environment was becoming less flexible. Adams responded in the way he had responded to difficulty for most of his life. He moved, he worked, he sailed. In 1616, he attempted a company voyage towards Siam. The plan did not unfold smoothly. Weather and navigation pushed the expedition away from its intended route, and the voyage was forced toward the Ryukyu Islands. It was another reminder that status at court could not control the sea. William Adams had crossed the Pacific. He had advised Ieyasu. He had land. He had a Japanese name. None of that changed wind. None of it changed currents. The sea remained the one authority in his life that had never cared about titles. He returned, and then he tried again. A later voyage to Siam was more successful. By now, Adams was no longer the young pilot who had departed Europe with 5 Dutch ships. He was entering his 50s. Decades at sea had accumulated in his body. He had survived climates that killed other men. He had crossed the Atlantic and Pacific. He had lived through illness, shipwreck scares, political interrogation, and the transformation of Japan. Yet the deck of a trading vessel was still familiar ground. Navigation remained something he could do. The geography of his life had expanded enormously. Kent, Limehouse, the Strait of Magellan, Bango, Osaka, Edo, Hemi, Hirado, Siam. Each name represented a different version of the same man. The apprentice, the pilot, the castaway, the foreigner, the retainer, the merchant, the husband in one country and husband in another, the father of children separated by oceans, and increasingly the intermediary whose usefulness depended on belonging completely to neither side. His English countrymen sometimes saw him as too Japanese. Japanese officials could never forget that he had been born abroad. The Dutch saw a Northern European who understood Tokugawa politics. The Portuguese had once seen an enemy. Ieyasu had seen a source of knowledge. Perhaps Adams himself saw something simpler, a man trying to make a workable life out of circumstances he had never chosen. After Ieyasu's death, that work became more important. The protection of a great patron was gone. What remained were the relationships Adams had built for himself. His estate, his Japanese household, his reputation, his maritime skill, his knowledge of regional trade, his connections with Richard Cox and the English factory, and the ability to continue traveling through a world that had once seemed impossibly distant. The final years of William Adams would not contain one grand transformation like the meeting in Osaka. They would contain something quieter: voyages, letters, commercial risks, arguments over trade, a government becoming more cautious about foreigners, an English factory slowly discovering that permission did not guarantee profit, and an aging navigator beginning to understand that even after England had finally found him, the question of home had not been solved. He had survived long enough to become famous among merchants who crossed Asian seas. But fame did not shorten the distance to Kent, and time was beginning to do what storms, disease, and politics had failed to do. It was closing the journey. William Adams had spent his life searching for routes. The last part of his story would be about the route he never took, the one back to England. By the final years of his life, William Adams had crossed so many boundaries that none of the simple labels quite fit him anymore. He was English. He was also Mura Anjin. He was a navigator who had survived a voyage that destroyed almost everyone around him. He was a Tokugawa retainer who had once stood before Ieyasu with no certainty that he would leave the room alive. He was a shipbuilder, a merchant, a landholder, a husband and father in Japan, and, somewhere across the oceans, still a husband and father in England as well. The extraordinary part of his story was no longer that he had reached Japan. It was that Japan had become the fixed point from which the rest of the world was now measured. When Adams sailed in his later years, he did not sail from Europe toward Asia. He sailed from Japan toward other parts of Asia and returned to Japan again. Home had changed direction. In the years after the English factory opened at Hirado, Adams became deeply involved in attempts to make English trade work. The East India Company wanted profit. That sounds obvious, but it is important because later stories sometimes treat the English presence in Japan as though it existed mainly for diplomacy or cultural exchange. The company was a commercial organization. Its ships were expensive. Its crews were expensive. Cargo tied up enormous amounts of capital for years. Every voyage represented a wager made by merchants who expected a return. Japan appeared promising. It had silver. It had large cities. It had wealthy consumers. It was connected to Chinese and Southeast Asian trade. But the English quickly discovered that entering a sophisticated market was very different from discovering an empty one. Japanese merchants already knew their customers. Chinese traders already moved goods through regional networks. Portuguese merchants had decades of experience connecting Japan with Macau and other ports. The Dutch were aggressive competitors. The English arrived late, and some of the goods they brought were simply not as desirable as they had hoped. Broadcloth, one of the staples of English trade, did not automatically become valuable because it had crossed half the world. A warehouse full of unsold merchandise was still a warehouse full of unsold merchandise. Distance made every mistake worse. If a factor in Hirado learned that a particular product sold badly, he could write to Bantam or London, but his letter might take months to reach the next commercial center. A new order might take another year or more to arrive. By then, prices could have changed again. In that environment, Adams's greatest advantage was not that he possessed secret knowledge. It was that he had lived in Japan long enough to understand that trade depended on relationships, timing, regional demand, and political permission. He knew that one successful audience with a ruler did not guarantee profitable commerce forever. He also understood that Japanese trade could not be separated from the larger Asian world. Silk from China mattered enormously. So did Southeast Asian goods. The English, therefore, needed to participate in regional shipping rather than wait for occasional vessels from Europe. This is where Adams returned to the sea. One of the ventures associated with him attempted to reach Siam. The kingdom centered on Ayutthaya, in what is now Thailand. The first attempt did not go as planned. A vessel left Japan with merchants, sailors, goods, and hopes of opening or strengthening trade. Weather disrupted the voyage. The ship was driven toward the Ryukyu Islands instead of reaching its intended destination. The episode was frustrating, expensive, and completely consistent with the maritime world Adams had known since youth. Plans were made on paper. The sea edited them. A year later, another voyage toward Siam succeeded. For Adams, the route south carried him through waters very different from the cold Pacific crossing that had first brought him to Japan. Southeast Asian trade moved through warm seas, islands, river mouths, monsoon winds, and ports where merchants from many regions met. Japanese traders were already active there. Chinese merchants were active there. Southeast Asian kingdoms maintained their own diplomatic and commercial systems. Europeans were only one group among many. Adams was now operating inside an Asian maritime economy rather than looking at Asia from the deck of a newly arrived European ship. That distinction matters. It changes the story from one of simple encounter to one of adaptation. He had learned enough to function within networks that had not been built for him. In 1617, he sailed toward Cochinchina in what is now central and southern Vietnam. He had commercial reasons for the journey and also hoped to learn what had happened to Englishmen who had previously traveled there. The expedition revealed again how fragile overseas trade could be. Information was incomplete. Men disappeared. Money vanished. Ships waited on uncertain news. A merchant sent ahead to establish contacts could die before anyone at Hirado learned what had happened. Every regional voyage created new chains of uncertainty. A factor might leave Japan carrying silver or goods. Months later, another man might arrive with a story rather than the person everyone expected to see. Adams had lived with that uncertainty since the Lefty lost sight of the hoop in the Pacific. Now he encountered it in commerce. He made further attempts toward the coasts of mainland Southeast Asia. One voyage was again frustrated by weather and forced toward the Ryukyus. Another carried him toward Tonkin in northern Vietnam. By then, he was an aging seaman by the standards of his world. He had spent more than 2 decades moving through dangerous maritime environments. The fact that he continued to sail tells us something important. His position as a hatamoto had not transformed him into a court ornament. He still worked. He still calculated routes. He still dealt with cargo. He still depended on winds. And he still accepted the possibility that any voyage might be the one from which he did not return. There was also a practical reason. The English factory at Hirado was struggling. Its commercial results were disappointing. Adams's private ventures sometimes offered opportunities that the factory itself needed. Richard Cox, the head of the English establishment, relied heavily on him. Cox kept a diary that gives historians an unusually detailed view of daily English commercial life in Japan. Through those records, the grand story becomes ordinary again. There were arguments about prices, complaints about sailors, accounts to balance, repairs, illness, gifts, rumors, ships overdue, letters expected, debts disputed, weather delaying departures, officials to visit, merchants arriving with news. The men living at Hirado did not wake each morning believing they were characters in a future historical drama. They were trying to keep a difficult trading post alive. Adams was one of the people making that possible. Cox came to respect him deeply. Their friendship was not built on romance or legend. It was built on years of practical cooperation. Cox needed Adams's knowledge of Japan. Adams needed the English connection that the factory represented. Each man understood that the other could do things he could not. That relationship would matter at the end of Adams's life. Before we reach it, however, there is another part of the world around him that was changing. Christianity in Japan had become increasingly dangerous. When Adams first arrived in 1600, Catholic missionaries had already been active in the country for decades. Some Japanese communities had converted. Some daimyo had supported Christian institutions. Portuguese trade and missionary activity were closely connected in certain regions, but Tokugawa attitudes hardened. The government increasingly treated Christianity not merely as a private belief, but as a possible political problem. A religion linked to foreign priests, foreign powers, and communities whose loyalties might cross domain boundaries could appear threatening to a state trying to stabilize authority. Restrictions grew. Missionaries were expelled or driven underground. Japanese Christians faced persecution. For Adams, the shift created a complicated position. He was Christian too, but Protestant. His survival in 1600 had partly depended on explaining that Europe was divided and that Portuguese Catholic accusations against him could not be treated as neutral truth. Over the following years, that distinction helped English and Dutch merchants compete with Iberian rivals. But Tokugawa's suspicion of Christianity did not exist simply to benefit Protestants. The government was becoming more cautious about foreign influence generally. The same state that valued overseas trade also wanted to control it. That tension would become one of the defining features of Japan's foreign relations in the decades after Adams's death. He did not live to see the mature system that later restricted most European trade to tightly controlled channels. But he witnessed the direction of change, and after Ieyasu died, he had less influence over it. Hidetada renewed Adams's status and allowed him to continue overseas trade. That was significant. It showed that Miura Anjin's place in Tokugawa society had not vanished with his patron. But the emotional and political relationship was different. Ieyasu had discovered Adams. He had questioned him repeatedly. He had tested his knowledge. He had ordered him to build ships. He had granted him land. There was no way to reproduce the uniqueness of that first connection. Adams now had to live on the strength of what he had already become. For the English factory, the years after Ieyasu's death were increasingly difficult. The Dutch were not friendly commercial neighbors. England and the Dutch Republic could cooperate in one place and compete violently in another. Asian trade sharpened those rivalries. Ships were seized. Arguments became political. News from distant conflicts reached Hirado and changed local calculations. European nationality mattered more when European companies fought over the same routes. Adams had once explained Europe to Ieyasu as a collection of rival states rather than a single Christian world. Now those rivalries were unfolding around the factory he was trying to support. The English position remained fragile. And yet Adams continued to think beyond the immediate crisis. One of the more curious ideas associated with his later years was the possibility of finding a northern route between Asia and Europe. The dream of a northwest or northeast passage had fascinated European navigators for generations. If a route could be found across the far north, ships might avoid the enormous journeys around Africa or through the Strait of Magellan. For a man who had taken nearly 2 years to reach Japan, the attraction was obvious. A shorter route was not merely a geographical curiosity. It could transform trade. Adams discussed the possibility. He encouraged English interest, but no great expedition sailed north from Japan under his command. The idea remained one more route on the edge of possibility. That feels appropriate. William Adams had spent his life moving along routes that other men drew imperfectly. Some existed, some failed, some vanished in storms. One carried him to Japan, one might have carried him home. The Northern Passage was never the one. By 1619, Adams was making what would be among his final long voyages. He traveled toward Tonkin. The voyage produced records of trade, expenses, crew, and navigation. Such documents can feel dry compared with stories of warlords and shipwrecks, but they show the real shape of Adams's later life. He had become a working maritime merchant, a man who negotiated not only between civilizations, but between invoices and winds. There is a temptation to think that once a historical figure reaches the most famous moment of his life, everything afterward becomes an epilogue. For Adams, the famous moment is usually his meeting with Ieyasu. But he lived for 20 years after arriving in Japan. Most of his Japanese life happened after the dramatic first encounter. Those years were not empty space. They were the years in which the accidental survivor became rooted. He learned enough Japanese to function. He traveled through the country. He acquired property. He raised children. He helped foreign merchants. He built ships. He sailed to Southeast Asia. He argued. He failed. He profited. He lost money. He wrote letters. He waited for replies. He watched rulers die. He watched political systems settle into permanence. And all the while, England remained somewhere beyond the sea. News from home eventually reached him more reliably than it had during his first decade in Japan. Letters could pass through company networks. Money could be arranged. Adams did not simply forget Mary and his English family. He made provisions for them. His surviving correspondence shows continued concern with his English connections. That does not erase the existence of his Japanese family. It makes the story more complicated, not less. Two households existed because one man's life had been divided by geography and time. Modern storytelling prefers clean emotional choices. Stay or return. Old life or new life. England or Japan? Adams's reality resisted that simplicity. He could care about people in England and still remain in Japan. He could value his Japanese household without pretending the English one had never existed. He could have permission to return and still decide not to sail. Human lives do not always divide neatly enough for a title card. As Adams entered his mid-50s, his health began to fail. The exact experience of his final illness is not preserved in the detail a modern biographer might want. That absence is worth respecting. We do not need to invent a dramatic deathbed conversation. We do not need to imagine a final vision of England or Ieyasu. The surviving record gives us enough. In the spring of 1620, William Adams was at Hirado. The place was fitting in a quiet way. Hirado had become the center of English trade in Japan. It was a port. Ships came and went. Merchants waited on weather. News moved across the water. It was exactly the kind of landscape that had shaped Adams's life from the beginning. He had been born near the Medway, among the maritime world of Kent. He would die beside another harbor, on the opposite side of the earth. On 16 May 1620, William Adams died. He was about 55 years old. The number itself seemed surprisingly small when placed beside the distances he had traveled. 55 years. Within that span, he had lived in Elizabethan England, crossed the Atlantic, passed through the Strait of Magellan, survived the Pacific, entered Japan before Sekigahara, met Tokugawa Ieyasu, watched the Tokugawa Shogunate emerge, built Western-style ships, received the status of a Hatamoto, helped establish Dutch and English relations, sailed again into Southeast Asia, and raised a family thousands of miles from the country of his birth. Richard Cox was deeply affected by his death. His response is one of the clearest signs that Adams had become more than a useful employee to the English merchants around him. Cox mourned the loss of a man who had enjoyed extraordinary favor with Japanese rulers and whose experience could not simply be replaced by bringing another pilot from England. That was true in the most practical sense. The East India Company could hire sailors. It could send factors. It could send captains. What it could not send was another man with 20 years of accumulated trust in Japan. Adams's knowledge had been made slowly. Conversation by conversation, journey by journey, mistake by mistake. No ship could carry that ready-made from London. His will divided property across the two worlds of his life. He left interests connected to his English family and to his Japanese children. His son Joseph inherited the Hemi estate and continued the Japanese line associated with Miura Anjin. That continuity matters because Adams's position in Japan did not simply disappear the moment he died. The estate remained part of the Tokugawa order. The name remained. Memory remained, but the English commercial presence he had helped establish did not survive for long. The factory at Hirado continued after his death. Richard Cox kept working. Merchants kept hoping. Accounts kept being written. But the basic problems remained. Trade was not profitable enough. Dutch competition was intense. Company resources could be used elsewhere. Political restrictions narrowed the possibilities. In 1623, only 3 years after Adams died, the English East India Company closed its factory in Japan. The surviving English merchants left. It is a striking ending to that part of the story. For years, Adams had dreamed of England reaching Japan. It finally did. He helped open the door. And then, within a decade, the English walked back through it. The Dutch remained, Portuguese influence would face its own dramatic decline. Tokugawa policy toward foreign contact continued to evolve. By the middle decades of the 17th century, Japan's external relations would operate under restrictions far tighter than anything Adams had encountered in 1600. William Adams, therefore, belonged to a very particular window in history. He arrived when political unification was still unfinished. He lived while Ieyasu was willing to experiment with multiple European partners. He served during a period when Japanese overseas traders moved actively through Southeast Asia. He died before the later Tokugawa system reached its more restrictive form. That timing helps explain why his career was possible. But timing alone does not explain everything. Other Europeans were in Japan. Other sailors understood navigation. Other merchants brought information. Adams's unusual position grew from a combination of circumstances and character. He arrived at exactly the right moment for Ieyasu to find his knowledge useful. He survived long enough to demonstrate practical skill. He learned to work within Japanese hierarchy. He avoided becoming merely an extension of one foreign commercial faction. He built things. He made himself useful. And he stayed. That last fact is the one later generations found most fascinating. An English sailor who stayed in Japan. A man given a Japanese name. A foreigner granted land and status under the Tokugawa. The outline was powerful enough to survive, even when details blurred. In Japan, the memory of Miura Anjin became attached to places. The Miura Peninsula preserved the connection through local tradition. In Edo, later Tokyo, a district name associated with Anjin remembered the pilot. In England, Adams gradually became a symbol of early contact between the two countries. But historical memory rarely leaves a life unchanged. Stories simplify. The navigator becomes a samurai. The retainer becomes a warrior. The complicated merchant becomes an almost mythical bridge between East and West. The divided family disappears behind a cleaner tale of choosing Japan. And then fiction adds another layer. Centuries after Adams died, his life became one of the foundations for the character John Blackthorne in James Clavell's novel Shogun. That connection introduced millions of readers and viewers to a fictional version of the basic situation. An English pilot, a wrecked European ship, Japan around the year 1600, a powerful lord whose position resembles that of Tokugawa Ieyasu, religious and commercial rivalry between Protestant newcomers and Portuguese Catholics, a foreigner learning to survive inside Japanese political society. Those similarities are real. They are why William Adams belongs in any discussion of the history behind Shogun. But Blackthorne is not William Adams with the name changed. This is where history becomes more interesting than the shortcut. The real Adams did not arrive and become the central actor in Japan's struggle for power. He did not decide Sekigahara. There is no historical basis for treating his life as the same romantic story told through Blackthorne. The people surrounding him were not simply hidden versions of fictional characters. Historical Japan was not waiting for an English protagonist to explain its own politics. Adams entered a political world that already possessed its own ambitions, conflicts, institutions, memories, and sophisticated strategies. Ieyasu's rise did not depend on him. If William Adams had died aboard the Leaf Day before reaching Bungo, Sekigahara would still have happened. Tokugawa Ieyasu would still have confronted his rivals. The great transformation of Japanese politics was a Japanese story. Adams became remarkable because he found a place within it. That distinction protects the value of the real history. It allows us to appreciate fiction without forcing the past to imitate it. And when we look closely, the real story contains things fiction does not need to invent. 5 ships leaving Europe and only 1 reaching Japan. A companion vessel disappearing forever in the Pacific. A crew so weak that only a handful could stand. A Protestant English pilot trying to explain European religious wars through an interpreter connected to his Catholic rivals. A Japanese lord questioning him and deciding that information was more useful than execution. A shipwright from Kent building Western-style vessels on the Ieyasu Peninsula. A man asking for years to go home, finally receiving permission and remaining anyway. A letter crossing the world until English merchants discover that a countryman believed lost has become a Tokugawa retainer. A sailor leaving England under Elizabeth I and meeting his countrymen again under James I. A Japanese-built vessel crossing the Pacific toward New Spain. A final life divided between Kent and Hemi. Mary and a Japanese household, William Adams and Mura Anjin. None of that requires embellishment. The historical uncertainty is part of the appeal. There are details we do not know. Private conversations were not recorded. Emotions must be inferred carefully. Names and dates sometimes vary between later accounts. Stories repeated for centuries accumulate decoration. A responsible telling has to leave some spaces empty. That is not a weakness. It is one of the ways history differs from fiction. Fiction can tell us exactly what a character thinks while standing on a ship at sunset. History often cannot. What it can do is show us the decisions. Adams left Europe. He survived. He answered Ieyasu's questions. He stayed. He served. He built. He wrote. He sailed again. He died in Japan. Those facts form a life without requiring us to invent the thoughts between them. And perhaps that is why the final image of William Adams does not need to be dramatic. We do not need Sekigahara. We do not need a sword. We do not need a throne. We can return instead to a harbor. Hirado, 1620. A ship waits offshore. Sails shift gently in the wind. Merchants move along the waterfront. Somewhere nearby, accounts are being written in English. Elsewhere, Japanese boats move between the islands. The sea beyond the harbor opens south toward the routes Adams had traveled in his final years, and east toward the great Pacific. He crossed once and never crossed back. If we follow that water far enough, through straits and oceans and around continents, it eventually leads to Kent, to the place where his life began. But William Adams is no longer traveling there. For most of his life, the sea had represented movement, a route outward, a chance to trade, a way to survive. At the end, the same sea became the distance that could no longer be closed. And yet, his story did cross it. Letters crossed, merchants crossed, memories crossed. Centuries later, novels, television dramas, historians, museums, monuments, and visitors would cross it again. The man himself never returned to England. His story did. That may be the strangest final turn of all. William Adams left home as a working sailor in an age when an ocean voyage could erase a person from the knowledge of everyone who loved him. For years, that nearly happened. Then he reached a coast his maps placed imperfectly. He met a ruler he had never heard of when he was a boy. He became valuable for skills learned in Kent, and the accident that prevented him from returning home created a second life large enough to be remembered 4 centuries later. Not because he conquered Japan, he did not. Not because he became the secret architect of the Tokugawa Shogunate, he was not. And not because the fictional stories inspired by him reproduce his life exactly. They do not. William Adams is worth remembering because the real achievement was quieter. He learned how to survive when almost every assumption he had carried from Europe stopped being useful. He learned how to make himself understood. He learned how to become useful without becoming powerful enough to control the world around him. He lived between political systems, languages, religions, commercial rivalries, and 2 families separated by the largest distances his age could imagine. And somehow, from a voyage that destroyed nearly everything with which it began, he built a life. So when we think of the English sailor behind Shōgun, perhaps the most accurate image is not a warrior standing in armor. It is a navigator, a man with a chart, a coastline that is not quite where the map says it should be, and the decision to keep sailing until land appears. The Liefde reached Japan in April 1600. 20 years later, William Adams died there. Between those 2 dates, the castaway became Miura Anjin. The stranger became a retainer. The lost Englishman became the man English merchants needed in order to find their way through Japan. And the country he had reached by accident became the place where his story ended. Outside Hirado, the tide would have continued to rise and fall after his death exactly as it had before. Ships came into harbor, other ships departed. Sailors watched the weather. Merchants counted cargo. Governments made new rules. The world moved forward. And somewhere across the water lay the road William Adams had spent years hoping to travel. The road home. He never took it. But more than 400 years later, we are still following the route he left behind.